On a quiet Sunday evening, I opened the door of my oceanfront home in Charleston and froze. After 11 long years of silence, the family who had cut me out of their lives stood there like ghosts, clutching suitcases and wearing smiles so strained they looked like cracks on porcelain masks. I had pictured this moment in my nightmares, but never in my waking life. My name is Maya Collins, and I am 34 years old. If you had asked me at 12 what family meant, I would have said love. I would have said safety. I would have said my dad's laugh on a snowy Saturday when he insisted that burgers tasted better grilled in the cold, or my mom's arms wrapping around me on the couch during movie night. Back then, I thought we were unbreakable, but I learned the hard way that love isn't always unconditional, and family isn't always forever. My father, Jeffrey, was my anchor, my biggest cheerleader, the man who told me bedtime stories about little girls who grew up to change the world. He used to say, "Maya, that will be you one day." I believed him, wholeheartedly. He never let me feel small. He made me believe I was capable of anything. And then, when I was just 11, a rainstorm took him from me on a slick highway. In a moment so sudden, the police said he never even had time to be afraid. That day cracked my world wide open. At the funeral, everyone wore black and whispered behind gloved hands. But what I remember most was my mother's grip on my hand. So tight it hurt, as if she was clinging to me for dear life. I thought we would heal together. I thought we would hold each other up. Instead, grief hollowed her out. Nights turned to weeks. Weeks turned into months. And still she stayed in bed with the curtains drawn. I learned how to microwave frozen dinners, how to get myself to school, how to keep the lights on when she forgot to pay the bill. I was a kid, acting like an adult, but every night I cried myself to sleep, missing Dad, missing who we used to be as a family. By the time I was 23, I was done, waiting for my mom to notice me again. I had survived on silence for too long, shrinking in the shadows of her new marriage, of her new daughter. That was when I packed my bags, took the keys to my beat-up car, and left without looking back. Now, all these years later, here they were, Mom, Grace, looking smaller but still impeccably dressed, Richard, my stepfather, with his once perfect hair thinning and his broad shoulders slumped, and Vanessa, my stepsister, standing tall beside her husband, Eric. Their eyes darted around my house, taking in the marble floors, the glass walls, the endless stretch of Atlantic Ocean glittering behind me. I opened the door wider, my heart pounding, but my face calm. "Come in," I said, as if this wasn't the very family who had made me feel invisible for more than a decade. They shuffled inside with hesitant steps, their suitcases rolling across the hardwood, leaving faint marks I knew I'd see later. They smiled, but not the way families smile when they've missed you. Their expressions were tight, rehearsed, like actors who had forgotten half their lines. And then I looked into their eyes. My mother's darting, Richard's calculating, Vanessa's unreadable. And I knew instantly. They weren't here for reconciliation. They were here because they had lost everything. If you are watching this, drop a comment telling me where you are from. Hit subscribe and stay tuned to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of being the forgotten daughter. I truly want to know how far my story will travel across the world and who out there understands what it feels like to be erased by the very people meant to love you. When I was little, life looked like something out of a postcard. I grew up in Boston, in a modest but warm home, with my father, Jeffrey, and my mother, Grace. Dad wasn't rich, but to me, he was larger than life. He worked long days as a civil engineer, and still, he never came home too tired to throw a football in the yard or grill burgers out back, even if there was snow piling up outside in January. He used to flip the patties with exaggerated flair, laugh booming into the frosty night, and say the snow made them taste better. Inside, Mom would roll her eyes, laughing, and pull me into her arms on the couch. Every night before I fell asleep, Dad sat by my bed and spun stories about fearless girls who dared to change the world. He'd tap my nose and whisper, "One day, Maya, that girl will be you." I held those words like a secret treasure. With him, I never doubted I was loved. But life has a cruel way of tearing holes in the fabric you thought was strong. When I was 11, my father's car skidded off a rain-soaked highway. The police told us it was instant, like he never even felt the crash. They said it as if it should comfort me. But I was shattered. At the funeral, all I could see was a blur of umbrellas, black dresses, and my mother's trembling hand gripping mine so hard it hurt. I thought grief would bind us tighter. Instead, it pulled her into a darkness I couldn't reach. For months afterward, she stayed in bed, curtains drawn, barely eating. I became the one making boxed macaroni and cheese for dinner, dragging myself through cold mornings to catch the bus to school, folding laundry I barely knew how to fold. I told myself I was strong, that Dad had prepared me for this. But at night, in the quiet, I would press my face into my pillow and cry until I couldn't breathe. Just when I thought maybe things would get better, another storm hit. A year after Dad's funeral, when I was 12, Mom sat me down in the living room. She wore lipstick for the first time in months, her hands smoothed over her dress like she was practicing being someone else again. "I want you to meet someone," she said softly. In walked Richard, tall, perfectly dressed, with a voice that filled the silence of our home like a trumpet blast. He put his hand on Mom's shoulder, as if he already owned her. "Your mother and I have been seeing each other for a while," he announced. "And we have some exciting news." I held my breath. "We're getting married," Mom said quickly, before I could even process it. "And Richard has a daughter, Vanessa. She's 19. You'll have a sister now. Isn't that wonderful?" My smile froze in place. Sister? I was only 12. Vanessa was already practically an adult. I had dreamed of a family that might love me again. But instead, I realized my little world of two, me and Dad's memory, was being swallowed whole. They looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to cheer, to clap, to act like this was good news. I nodded stiffly, but inside, a chill spread through me. And then, as I reached to shake Richard's hand, I caught a glimpse of something sticking out of his leather briefcase, a legal document stamped with my own name. Why would my stepfather be carrying paperwork about me before I'd even agreed to call him family? When we moved into Richard's mansion in Charleston, everyone told me how lucky I was. Neighbors admired the wraparound porch, the towering palm trees, the view of the water that glittered like glass at sunrise. But to me, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage set, polished marble floors that clicked under my sneakers, walls so white they made me whisper, rooms too big for one girl to ever fill. Vanessa's room was 3 times the size of mine, with a walk-in closet already lined with designer shoes. The first time I knocked on her door, holding a plate of cookies I had baked to welcome her, she barely glanced up from her glossy magazine, her lip curled in a half smile, half sneer. "Let's get one thing straight," she said. "We're not sisters. Our parents might be married, but that doesn't make you family. So do me a favor. Stay out of my room and out of my business." I froze, clutching the plate, the cookies cooling in my hands. Then I turned and walked back to my own room, It was larger than the one Dad and I had shared back in Boston, but it felt sterile. The walls were blank. The carpet was spotless, none of the messy paint stains from our art projects. Even my father's framed photos looked out of place, like strangers in a borrowed space. Richard wasn't cruel to me directly. He didn't yell or hit. He simply ignored me. He'd pass me in the hallway without a glance. But when Vanessa entered the room, his whole face lit up. She was his daughter, his princess. When she got accepted to her dream college at 19, he threw a party that cost at least $30,000 with a band and an ice sculpture shaped like a swan. I remember standing in the corner, my science fair ribbon crumpled in my hand. I had just won first place at the regional competition at 15. But when I mentioned it at dinner, Richard barely looked up from his newspaper. "That's nice," he muttered, before turning the conversation back to Vanessa's future. What cut the deepest wasn't even Richard's indifference. It was my mom. The woman who once tucked me in every night and kissed my forehead now seemed to shrink in his shadow. If he mocked the way I held my fork or dismissed my clothes as cheap, she would give me that look, the one that said, "Just do as he says, Maya. Don't make it harder." Our conversations dwindled into short, practical exchanges. "Did you finish your homework? Don't forget the dishes." Gone were the soft whispers of encouragement. Gone was the mother who once swore I could be anything. At night, when the house quieted down, I'd write in my journal by flashlight, page after page, filled with words I couldn't say out loud. I scribbled one line so often it blurred. If I disappeared for a whole year, would anyone even notice? One afternoon, while taking the trash outside, I saw something odd. A pile of envelopes sat at the bottom of the bin, edges curled from dampness. I recognized my own handwriting. Immediately, my letters. The birthday cards I had mailed to Mom after I left at 23. I had written them to see if she would finally open one. Each envelope was sealed tight, stamped in red. Returned to sender. I froze, holding the discarded envelopes in my hands, my chest burning. That was when I realized the ugliest truth. They hadn't just ignored me, they had made sure I would never even have a chance to be heard. And as I stood there, clutching those unopened envelopes, I heard the faint click of a door upstairs. Someone had been watching me the whole time. By the time I turned 15, I had learned how to survive in silence. I kept my head down, excelled in school, and pretended not to notice when Richard favored Vanessa over me. But inside, I was counting the days. Every test I aced, every paper I wrote, was a step toward the future my dad had promised me, a future he had prepared for, with the $85,000 college fund he set aside before his accident. That money was supposed to be my lifeline, my escape hatch, my proof that he hadn't left me completely unprotected. One evening, after weeks of building up courage, I walked to Richard's home office. He was behind his massive oak desk, glasses low on his nose, tapping a calculator with the same intensity he used to glare at me across the dinner table. I knocked on the doorframe, my heart racing. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I need to know how much is in my college fund. Dad told me he saved for me. I have to plan ahead." He leaned back slowly, steepling his fingers. A smirk spread across his face, smug and sharp. "That money's been reallocated," he said. The word felt foreign. Reallocated? What does that mean? He didn't hesitate. "It means it's gone." Vanessa's tuition was higher than we expected. Plus, there were some investments that needed funding. Your mother signed the papers. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My knees trembled, and I gripped the doorframe to keep from collapsing. My dad had worked overtime shifts for years, saving every dollar he could for my education. And now It was gone. That money was for me, I whispered, choking on the words. He promised. Richard's expression hardened. Don't be dramatic, Maya. You live under my roof. That makes this my responsibility. I use the funds for the good of this family. You can take out loans. Like everyone else, I turned to my mother, desperate. Mom, you agreed to this. You let him? She wouldn't look at me. Her hands twisted in her lap as she muttered, He knows more about finances than I do. We had to make tough choices. You'll survive. That was the word she chose, as if survival was the same as being loved, as if barely scraping by was enough for me. That night, in my room, I decided I would play along, stay quiet, and finish high school. But the day I graduated, at 17, I'd be gone. Until then, I'd work every shift I could, stash away every dollar, and apply to any scholarship that might give me a chance. Still, the betrayals kept piling up. One night, while sorting through the mail, I noticed an unfamiliar envelope with my name on it, already opened. My stomach twisted. Later, digging through the trash, I found a crumpled phone bill with my social security number on it. The account wasn't mine. It had been used for 10 months, racking up late payments that wrecked my credit before I even became an adult. At the bottom of the page was a signature. Richards. I sat on the floor, clutching the paper, rage and heartbreak colliding inside me. This wasn't just about my college fund anymore. This wasn't just neglect. It hit me like a tidal wave. They weren't simply forgetting me. They were rewriting my future, erasing me on purpose. And the worst part, my mother was letting it happen. By the time I turned 21, I had managed to claw my way into Riverside University on a scholarship. It wasn't a full ride, but it was enough to cover most of my tuition. The rest I pieced together with sheer stubbornness. 2 part-time jobs, one at a bookstore, and another wiping down tables at a late-night diner. I shared a rundown apartment with 3 other students, and our tiny place rattled every time the train roared by. The walls were thin. The heat broke every other week, and sometimes I'd fall asleep on a sagging mattress after pulling a double shift, my stomach growling from skipping dinner so I could afford textbooks. I lived like a ghost, drifting between classes and work, rarely speaking to anyone unless I had to. My roommates partied, invited friends over, laughed until dawn. I would sit at my desk with my laptop, coding by the light of a desk lamp, while their music rattled the walls. It was lonely, exhausting, and yet my grades soared. Straight A's, semester after semester. The more Richard sneered at my late nights, the harder I worked, determined to prove him wrong, even if he never saw it. One person did notice. Mrs. Whitaker, my English professor, stopped me after class one afternoon. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pinned neatly back and eyes that could cut through excuses like glass. Maya, she said, I've watched you. You don't just work hard, you work with purpose. Don't ever confuse their silence with your worth. You are more than the way they treated you. Her words struck something in me. For years, I'd buried my father's voice under layers of doubt, but hearing her, I felt a flicker of belief again. Maybe I was capable of more than surviving. Around that time, I stumbled into the university's startup incubator. At first, I joined just to avoid going home to my noisy apartment. But when it came time to pitch ideas, something inside me clicked. I stood in front of the group and described a mobile app I'd been tinkering with, one that helped students track classes, manage part-time jobs, and stretch every dollar of their financial aid. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. It was my life in code. To my surprise, people leaned in. They asked questions, offered suggestions, even wanted to test it. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. My story, my struggles, had value, I remember walking home that night with a rare sense of lightness in my chest, the kind that made the flickering streetlights seem almost like stars. I thought, maybe, just maybe, I was building something that could carry me out of the shadows for good. But the past has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. One evening, after a long shift at the diner, I checked my email. There it was, a message from my mother. My heart leapt into my throat. After all this time, had she finally reached out to mend things? The subject line read, "We need to talk." My hands shook as I clicked it open. The email was short, almost businesslike. She explained that Richard's latest venture was in trouble. They were facing a $120,000 shortfall. She didn't ask how I'd been. She didn't ask about school. She simply asked if I could help the family by lending them the money. I sat, frozen, staring at the words on the glowing screen, every old wound ripping open again. And then, slowly, I began typing my reply. But the words forming on my screen weren't the ones they were expecting. When I left home at 17, I thought survival meant scraping by, holding on until the world finally broke me. But at 21, when I got that scholarship to Riverside University, something shifted. I realized I didn't have to just endure. I could build. So I threw myself into my little idea, the productivity app I had dreamed up while juggling shifts and classes. Most people saw a tired girl hunched over her laptop at 2 a.m, nursing cold coffee and typing like her life depended on it. And maybe it did. That app became my lifeline, my secret rebellion against everything Richard ever said about me being nothing without his roof. Every line of code was proof that I could create something from nothing. In my junior year, I presented my prototype at a local tech event. My hands trembled, my voice cracked. But when I finished, the applause was real. That was when I met Daniel Ramirez, a sharp-eyed angel investor who saw something in me no one else had. "Your idea isn't just clever," he told me, pressing his business card into my palm. "It's necessary. And so are you." Within a month, he invested $60,000 into my company and, more importantly, became the mentor I never had at home. With his guidance, I built a team, 14 people who believed in my vision. We worked out of a cramped studio at first, wires running across the floor like vines, whiteboards filled with frantic scribbles, pizza boxes stacked high. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Every contract we landed, every student who downloaded the app, felt like reclaiming a piece of the future Richard had stolen from me when he drained my $85,000 college fund. By the time I was 25, just 4 years after graduation, everything exploded in ways I never dreamed. My app was generating revenue. Universities were licensing it, and venture capital firms were knocking on my door. I sold part of the company to a larger firm for several million, but I insisted on staying on as CEO. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. I bought a 6-bedroom glass-walled house overlooking the Atlantic. It was more house than one woman needed, but it was mine. Every beam, every window, every view earned with my own sweat. I stood barefoot on the deck, the salty wind in my hair, the ocean roaring like an anthem of freedom. I had built everything they said I couldn't. And yet, even in all that beauty, silence followed me. The family who had cast me aside at 23 had never once called, never written, never knocked, until the night they appeared with their bags and brittle smiles. I told myself I didn't care anymore, but deep inside, I felt the sting of being unwanted, of being erased by people who should have loved me without conditions. As I prepared for the charity gala hosted by my foundation, a night to celebrate students who, like me, had survived family betrayal, I felt a rare surge of pride. I had taken my pain and turned it into purpose. That's when the doorbell rang. A man in a suit stood outside, holding an envelope. He cleared his throat. "Maya Collins?" I nodded. He handed me the papers. "You've been served." My stomach dropped as I read the words. Richard was suing me, demanding $200,000, claiming it was his right after all these years because of the family investments he made with my father's money. My lawyer glanced over the document, then leaned close, voice low. "Maya," he said, "you may have to face them in court sooner than you think." My world tilted again, and I knew the real battle hadn't even started yet. The night of the gala should have been mine. My foundation had grown beyond what I ever dreamed. What started as one tiny app was now a movement that helped students across the country. I wore a deep navy gown that shimmered beneath the chandeliers, and for once, I felt like I truly belonged in the spotlight. Cameras flashed, hands reached to congratulate me, and for the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. I was undeniable. And then I saw them. Across the ballroom, moving like they owned the place, stood my mother, Grace, her hair cut into a sharp bob, a pearl necklace glittering at her throat. Beside her was Richard, still tall, but smaller somehow, his confidence forced. Vanessa stood close, every strand of her hair in place, designer gown hugging her figure. In her arms was a baby swaddled in a pale pink blanket. Eric trailed just a step behind, smiling too wide for the cameras that turned toward them. My chest tightened. They weren't supposed to be here. My foundation's guest list had been carefully curated. Donors, partners, young scholars. And yet, there they were, waving at photographers, laughing like we'd all spent the last 11 years together. As the night unfolded, they mingled with ease, posing for pictures, as if we were one happy family. I watched, numb, until the moment came. My mother raised her champagne flute, her voice smooth and practiced. "To Vanessa and Eric," she said, beaming, "the couple who carry our legacy forward." Legacy. The word hit me like glass, shattering on marble. Whose legacy? My father's? The man Richard replaced? The one they let fade into silence? My hands trembled under the table, but I forced myself to rise. The chatter around us fell into a hush as I walked toward the stage, heels clicking like gunshots against the polished floor. I took the microphone from her hand. "If we're talking about legacies," I said, my voice even but sharp, "then let's be honest about whose story we're really celebrating tonight." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a stack of documents. One by one, I laid them on the podium. The returned letters, their envelopes still sealed, stamped, "Returned to sender." The forged cell phone contract that had haunted me for 10 long months. The official notice revoking the power of attorney Richard had once wielded like a weapon. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Faces turned, phones lifted, recording every word. I looked directly at Richard. "You took what my father left me. You silenced me for over a decade. And now you show up, with your debts and your smiles, asking me to save you?" His jaw clenched, but before he could speak, my mother's hand shot out. She gripped the microphone again, her knuckles pale. Her voice cracked, but it carried through the room. "Maya, you don't know the whole truth. Richard made me sign those papers. He had leverage over me. Something I never told you." The ballroom went still. Even the clinking glasses stopped. My stepfather's face flushed an alarming shade of red. Vanessa's smile collapsed into confusion, her eyes darting from me to her mother. And then my mother's hands shook as she reached into her purse, pulling out a folded photograph. She held it tightly, as though it might burn her if she let go. When she opened it on stage and looked straight at me, I saw what was printed on that paper, and my blood ran cold. When my mother unfolded that photograph under the chandelier's glare. The room tilted. The image was grainy, a little faded, but unmistakable. Richard, arm draped around another woman, his lips pressed against her cheek in a hotel lobby. The date stamp in the corner, 10 years ago. He had been cheating on my mother almost since the day they married. And worse, she confessed right there, voice trembling through the microphone, that Richard had forced her to sign away my $85,000 college fund because he threatened to expose her secret affair if she refused. My stomach twisted. For years, I believed my mother had simply chosen him over me. Now I saw something uglier. She hadn't just chosen him, she had let him control her through shame. She admitted she had been terrified of being alone again, of losing the comfort and status Richard provided after Dad's death. I was weak, she whispered, clutching that photo as though it were both evidence and confession. I let him silence me, and I let him take you from me. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt powerful. Instead, I felt a hollow ache. All those 11 years weren't just about cruelty. They were about fear, cowardice, and choices she hadn't been brave enough to make. It didn't excuse what she allowed to happen, but it explained why the woman who once held me so close had become a stranger. The timing of Richard's lawsuit turned out to be his biggest mistake. The FBI had already been circling his shady land deals in Georgia, 3 hours away, where he had funneled money into a $200,000 project that crumbled before it even broke ground. The photograph, along with the forged paperwork on my accounts, drew their full attention. Within 3 weeks, Richard was indicted for fraud and coercion. The same man who once lorded power over me now sat in a courtroom, sweating under the weight of his lies. But the aftermath wasn't simple. Eric reached out privately, holding his newborn daughter in his arms. He admitted he had known about Richard's betrayal months before, but kept quiet, fearing what would happen to Vanessa if the truth came out. His voice cracked as he asked if I would still review his business plan. Not for money, but for guidance. I agreed, on one condition: no loans, no checks, no blank favors. I would introduce him to 2 trusted advisors, and then they would have to stand on their own. Vanessa surprised me too. She sent me a letter, pages of ink smudged with what looked like tears. She confessed that the day she ruined my father's photo album, it wasn't an accident. She had been jealous, convinced that no matter what she achieved, I would always carry something she couldn't. Dad's love. For the first time, she admitted her cruelty was born of fear. I didn't forgive her instantly. Old wounds don't close just because someone says sorry. But I didn't shut her out either. That, I realized, was progress. Mom began therapy, just like she had promised at the gala. After each session, she sent me a small note, sometimes even a copy of her appointment card. Proof she was trying. Proof she was willing to face the ghosts she'd allowed into our lives. Meanwhile, I poured my energy into the foundation, expanding it to include legal aid clinics for young adults whose guardians had misused trust funds, like mine. Helping others fight for their rights felt like reclaiming my father's voice. It was as if his promise, that I would grow up to change the world, was finally echoing into reality. Richard lost everything. The indictment broke him, and he slipped out of our lives without so much as a goodbye. My mother, slowly, cautiously, began to rebuild something with me. Vanessa and I weren't suddenly close, but when I connected her husband with those 2 advisors, she thanked me without a hint of entitlement. It was fragile, but it was something real. One evening, after the chaos had settled, I sat on my deck, the Atlantic stretching endless and wild before me. I held the gold watch Dad gave me on my 11th birthday, the steady tick reminding me of who I am. They once tried to erase me, but I had carved out a life of my own, a life filled with meaning, strength, and love that they could never take away. I used to think revenge meant destroying the people who hurt you. But I've learned the sharpest revenge is living fully, setting boundaries, and refusing to let betrayal define you. Family isn't blood. Family is who shows up, who protects you, who loves you without condition. And sometimes, the truest power is not in vengeance, but in choosing peace. When your past knocks with flowers and debts in hand, would you answer with anger, with silence, or with boundaries?